Okay, welcome back. I'm Oliver Landy, photographer from the UK, and this is my second part of my lens video, everything you need to know about lenses. Okay, so in the first part, if you haven't seen it, go check it out. We talked roughly about what type of lenses there are, zooms versus primes, and what the focal length means, and max apertures, and when you might use certain lenses over others. So in this video, we're going to look at how different focal lengths affect different images and why you would choose certain things over others. We're going to go into the limitations of certain focal lengths and why people can't or can use different lenses in different scenarios. We're going to talk about the effect of focal length on depth of field. I'm going to give you my recommendation on the first lenses that you should try and buy and get into your kit that are going to help you, and give you some tips on specific genre lenses. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of specialty lenses to finish up. Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, so we talked about how focal length affects how much of the image or the scenery in front of you can actually see. And the more zoomed in you get, the less you can see, and the bigger the objects get relative to you. So if you're shooting a football game, for example, the players are going to be quite small unless you can use a telephoto lens and get nice and close in. Okay, so but how does that actually affect backgrounds, and what are the relative effects of that? So if you were to go out, and actually I'm going to use an example here. So what I've done here is I've started off by taking a shot at 15mm, which is very wide, and then I've taken a series of photos where I use a slightly longer focal length each time, and I move back to try and keep the motorcycle as close to the same size in the frame as I could get it. And why I've done this is to show you the effect of different focal lengths, and essentially what you'll see as we step back to 24 and then again to 35 and then 50 and so on, is that the amount of the background that you can see gets less and less, and the image gets tighter and tighter and tighter as you get towards the longer focal lengths. Now bear in mind that in order to do this, I'm having to move back and shoot from further away each time in order to keep this the same size. If I wasn't moving back, what you'd be seeing is the image would get closer and closer, or more and more zoomed in, to the point where you're only seeing a tiny section of the bike. But just look at the effect as I essentially zoom in and zoom out of focal lengths, of how much of the surrounding background you can actually see. And when you're all the way zoomed in to 200mm, how it has a completely different look to all the way back out at 15mm. So the thing to bear in mind here is that some subjects will look better shot wide, where you can see a lot of the surrounding area, and some shots will look better or just different when you're all the way zoomed in and you're trying to avoid showing things in the surrounding area by zooming all the way into 200mm or just longer focal lengths. The only thing to bear in mind with this is that there are some limitations, and one of them is distortion. So if you're shooting really wide, the effect is that things that are closer to the frame will appear larger than they actually are relative to other objects, particularly if that's a face or a person. It can look quite odd, and also things towards the edges of the frame tend to get some bowing, and that's if you're using super wide angle lenses. So just watch out for that, and we'll talk about the limitations of shooting on longer focal lengths in a second. So if you were shooting an environmental portrait, which is a type of portraiture where you actually want to show the environment that someone's in, so just to use a sports example, maybe you'd shoot them on a football field or something with a goal in the background, so that you can actually see the scenario that they're in. Or if they're a teacher, you might shoot them at the front of a lecture hall with the blackboard behind them or something like that. And so that in that instance, you want to see the background, so you need to shoot it with a wider focal length, so 24, 35, something like that, and potentially get just a touch further back. Whereas if you just wanted to focus on just the person and you only wanted to take, say, a tight headshot, you might take them outside, get them nice and far away from the background, and then take a nice zoomed in shot to really blur out the background. So those are sort of two common examples of where you might or how focal length actually affects images. Another scenario might be if you're trying to crop out distracting elements of a photo. So you actually really like a photo of a particular scenario, but there's a bin in the photo and you don't want to show the bin. So you just crop in slightly and you can remove the bin and keep the rest of the photo relatively simple. Okay, so there's a couple of limitations when you're working with lenses, and with wide angle lenses, as we talked about before, it's distortion. Distortion is the limit of or why you wouldn't necessarily want to work super wide all the time, because you can't just, and sometimes you can't get closer, but the image, it depends on what you're shooting. Sometimes a wide angle lens is perfectly fine and you can go really crazy wide and it doesn't matter because the subject of the photo, or let's say you're shooting video and you're shooting something like skateboarding, classically shot with like a really wide fisheye lens where you can actually see the circle around the outside, but they have almost 180-degree vision. So as long as you're pointing the camera roughly in the right direction, the person doing the action sport in front of you is going to be in focus. So GoPros and other action cameras tend to be very wide for that reason. And they don't care if it's a little bit distorted, because what's more important is the fact that the subject of the thing you're filming is in the frame. And the other end, so telephoto, as we talked about in shutter speed, is often camera shake. So if you have got a big long lens and you're trying to take a photo and it's moving around, then it's very hard to actually hold a big lens like that still without it being stabilized by a tripod or a monopod or something like that. So you have to use quite fast shutter speeds. Now, in wildlife photography, for example, that's not a problem, because generally speaking, you're going to be shooting at faster shutter speeds to kind of freeze the bird flying or whatever it might be. So, but what you just need to be aware of is handshake and something called the reciprocal rule. So the reciprocal rule is a basic guideline for you should always shoot at least your focal length or higher. And obviously the higher, the better in terms of reducing camera shake. So if you're shooting on a 200mm, you should be shooting at least 200th of a second or faster, and generally the further you go up the focal length, the faster you should add on, or the more you should add on to the reciprocal rule. So if you're shooting on a 50mm, at least a 50th of a second. We also talked about in the shutter speed video about how some things will have blur just because they're moving, like people, but when we're just talking about lenses, the reciprocal rule is the focal length or higher. And if you can't shoot handheld that fast or that slow, then you need to stabilize it somehow with a monopod or putting it down on something, or a tripod or whatever. The only other thing to add to this is that some lenses now have something called image stabilization. Now it's called image stabilization with Canon. It's vibration reduction with Nikon, I think, and Nikon, and optical stabilization is another one, I guess, but essentially it's the same thing. One of the elements inside the lens, like this lens for example, it's a little switch on the side that says stabilization on or off, and one of the elements inside the lens essentially is a floating element which reduces vibration and shake, and it's different in different lenses, and it has the amount of kind of stabilization, or the amount of offset that you can get from it, varies from system to system. And some modern cameras also have digital or physical image stabilization in the camera. It's called in-body stabilization, and essentially what it does is it just allows the camera to micro move the sensor to adjust for movements, and it allows you to shoot at longer shutter speeds without introducing that blur effect. And they're obviously they're more expensive and heavier and things like that, lens wise, but they're well worth it. I can say that the sharpest lens that I have without a doubt is my 85 1.4L IS, gosh, mouthful, because of that image stabilization. You wouldn't actually think that it affects images that much, but it really can, and it can do it without you noticing, because when you're looking at it on the back of a camera, it looks sharp, you think, yeah, brilliant, nailed it, and you carry on to the next one. But actually, when you get on the computer and you start zooming in, you can see the blur. So just be aware of the reciprocal rule. If you're getting blurry images and you're not sure why, chances are it's the shutter speed is too low for the lens that you're shooting. Okay, so when you're shooting with telephoto lenses, it's the depth of field that you get with telephoto lenses is generally better than you get with wider lenses. So essentially, wider lenses are easier to get everything in focus. In telephoto lenses, your depth of field gets narrower, and there's lots of reasons for this. It's all to do with the law of optics, but essentially, the closer you are to your subject, the further away your subject is from the background, and the more zoomed in you are all ways that you can affect how much of a depth of field you have. And a really shallow depth of field creates really blurry backgrounds, and blurry backgrounds are a really good way to isolate your subject. And we're going to talk about subject isolation in depth in another video, but for now it's just well, I'll show you an example. Take a look at this photo of McLaren. So this was shot in a parking garage, and I've shot this at 200mm, and I've got nice and low to the ground, so that it's nicely framed and everything. But as you can see, the background is blurred, and so is the foreground, and the only thing that's in focus is the car. And it's a really powerful tool to have in your arsenal when you can do this, where you can blur out that background. But the limitation is I had to shoot this from about 50 feet away. In fact, possibly even more than that, maybe 100 feet away, in order to get this particular composition at this focal length. Now, this was possible because it was an empty parking garage sort of at night or in the evening, and it was nice and long, so we parked the car in the middle of the garage, and I was able to walk all the way back and get this photo. So if I so the limitation is working distance. If you shoot everything at really long focal lengths, you're miles away from your subject, and sometimes that doesn't matter, but other times it can be a right pain. So if you're shooting a person, for example, and you want to talk to them because you're going to give them some pointers on posing or expressions, or just to interact with them, if you're 50 feet away, that's no good. You're going to have to shout. So quite often portraiture is done on kind of 85, 50mm, 100mm lengths, just so that you're actually close enough to the person that they can hear you when you're talking to them, and so that you don't have people walking in between you and things like that. So working distance is an issue with the longer focal length. Okay, so now that we've sort of talked about lenses and you know what's going on with them, where do you start and what do you buy first? Now, there is lots of different options on this depending on where you're at with your photography journey, what your kind of budget is, what type of photography it is you're doing. So these rules or these ideas are kind of general rules, but you need to be aware of the fact that they may change based around your individual scenario. And again, if you've got any questions, do go and talk to your local camera shop, or drop me a comment and I'll try and do my best to answer them. So generally speaking, when you buy your first camera, you're going to get some sort of kit lens with it. You can buy cameras without any lenses at all and then buy whatever you want instead of paying the extra money for the kit lens. But if you want an all-purpose lens, kit lenses are good for that. They give you a kind of quite a wide focal range, from kind of wide to relatively zoomed in. Normally kind of 24 to 70, 24 to 105, that kind of region. And they're a great place to start. If you're at the very, very beginning of your photography journey, then by all means, yeah, 24 to 105 is a great shout. And for a lot of lenses, they're really good actually. Modern kit lenses aren't, that bad. However, assuming that you want to get a step above the kit lens, the next thing I would suggest would be a nifty 50. Now, most manufacturers will have some version of this. It's a 50mm and it's got a wider aperture than a typical kit lens. So like I said before, the Canon kit lens for the basic camera was a 3.5 to 5.6, whereas the nifty 50, the cheapest one, is a 1.8. So it goes down much, much wider than a kit lens. It's only a 50mm, so it doesn't zoom, but it will open up that world of being able to play with much shallower depths of field, blur out that background, and start really playing around with photography. And when you start doing that, you'll notice that people look at your images differently, because it's not something that you're used to seeing from sort of easy smartphone click photography. It's more involved, and it looks much more pleasing in a lot of scenarios. So getting yourself a nifty 50 and or the equivalent for Nikon or Sony, generally speaking they're kind of around 100-150 pounds if you buy them new, but you can pick them up on eBay really cheaply because people buy them, they use them, they get more into photography, they want a higher quality lens, so they then upgrade it down the road. Is what I did. This is the 1.4, which is kind of like the step above the nifty 50, and I use this as my go-to lens for well over 2 years until I upgraded eventually to getting the 85. But you get a lot of bang for your buck with that lens. So if you've got a kit lens and a 50mm 1.8, then that's a really good start. Then you get into the realm of building out your kit so that you've got a bigger range of focal length, so a wider angle lens, so either a wide prime, so there's lots of wide primes out there that are really good, 15-16mm from sort of Samyang or Sigma or one of the kind of third-party lens manufacturers. I'll touch on that in a second. And the same at the upper end. You can get some really nice kind of 135 primes that are cheaper than some of the other options that help you build out your kit. So you've got a wider option, you've got your kit lens as your general lens, you've got the 50 for when you want to do shallow depth of field, and then you've got a longer telephoto lens as well. And then eventually you'll upgrade to what's called the Holy Trinity, which is or traditionally it's a 16-35 f2.8, a 24-70 f2.8, and a 70-200 f2.8. Now 2.8 is quite a wide aperture. It does give you a relatively shallow depth of field, way more than you'd get out of a kit lens. And if you have those three lenses, then you can essentially cover almost any scenario apart from really telephoto. So things like events or weddings, or doing portraiture of people, or anything, pretty much street photography, you name it, you can do it with those three lenses. Almost all situations anyway. Yeah, like I say, wildlife photography and sports photography, you might need to go a little bit higher than that, but that's why it's called the Holy Trinity, because many pros will use just those three lenses, and that's all they have in their bag, and that's their go-to, and that's what they stick with. And then after that, you might start looking at some more specialty lenses, like specifically ones focused on portraiture, or for things like architectural photography, where you want a really wide lens that doesn't have any distortion. Tilt shift lenses, that's another one, but we'll cover that in another one. So that's where I would start. I'd start with kit lens and a nifty 50, and then go to a wider angle lens, then a telephoto lens, or go into the Holy Trinity of the 16-35, the 24-70, and the 70-200s. All manufacturers will have a version of these lenses because they're so useful and so versatile, and they're pretty much standard. And there are also third-party manufacturers that will produce these lenses as well. So briefly, let's touch on that. So third-party lenses versus the kind of branded manufacturer lenses. Now, it always used to be that third-party lenses were a cheap and pretty bad alternative to the manufacturer lenses. Part of it was to do with the lenses didn't communicate particularly well with the camera, so you potentially get things like focusing issues, and they just weren't as sharp, and they just weren't as good. Now, actually, third-party lenses from companies like Sigma, Tamron, and Rokinon, and there's a whole bunch of different ones, they're actually much higher quality than they used to be relative to the branded lenses. I think personally that the branded lenses still have an edge. They're designed and built for those systems, so if you're shooting Canon and you use Canon lenses, you're going to potentially get more reliable results than if you were trying to use a third-party lens. But the trade-off is third-party lenses are cheaper. So if you're just starting out and you want to get going as quickly as you can and you've got a limited budget, yeah, pick up a third-party lens. I particularly recommend the Sigma Art series. They're really strong lenses. They're quite heavy, but other than that, they're really good image quality, and they work really well with most bodies, and they're actually manufactured with those lens mounts in mind, so they're not adapted, so it literally is just screw on, works as if it is a normal Canon or Nikon lens, whatever it is. And they are really good, and they're generally sort of 30 to 40% cheaper than the equivalent Canon or Nikon lens. Quickly on that one, I've very briefly touched on it. You've got adapters, so it is possible, this is an adapter for my Canon EOS R, it is possible to get adapters so that you can put different lenses on different cameras. There's umpteen different versions of these depending on what camera you're trying to adapt what lens to, and so on and so on. But again, if you've got any questions about can I use a particular lens with a particular camera, then go talk to a camera shop, or if you're really brave, go on to some photography forums and post a question. Okay, so we talked briefly about what lenses you use for what, and we've kind of touched on some principles, but I'm going to do a whole series on each different sort of photography genre and my top tips for those genres, and within those we'll talk about what lenses I would use, or generally speaking what lenses are used for those genres. But there are no absolute rules. It's actually quite an interesting exercise to go out and use a kind of counter cultural lens for a particular thing. And so that's what this week's exercise is. I want you to go out and I want you to shoot portraits on a super wide angle, or I want you to go out and shoot landscapes with a telephoto lens, and see what kind of results you get. Sometimes it will just validate the fact that shooting landscapes on wide is what you prefer, but sometimes you'll pick up absolute gems. So I'm going to put an image up on the screen here, and this is an image that I took with my 200mm, and it was in the Surrey Hills, and I was taking a big wide shot of the sunrise and the tower there. But then I shot on the 200mm, and I got this beautiful sort of layered photo of all the different scales as it went back right onto the horizon, and it was a nice misty sunrise morning. And you never get that kind of detail with a wide angle lens. It's a totally different perspective. So go out, pick a subject, shoot portraits with wide angle, shoot landscapes with a telephoto, and just break all the rules and see what kind of results you get. Okay, one final thing before the recap. There are kind of speciality lenses, so lenses that are built with a specific purpose in mind, and they can be, some of them can be used for more than one thing, but here's a sort of quick guide into those. So you've got macro lenses. So macro lenses are to do with the fact that if you want to get really, really close to something, lenses have a minimum focus distance, and I think, for example, this 85mm, the closest you can get to it is about, I think it's about there. Anything closer than that and it just won't focus, it can't focus on it. So if you wanted to, say, take a shot of a flower or a bug, or some jewelry or something like that, then you need to get much, much closer to the object, and therefore you need a macro lens. So there are specific lenses that have this kind of macro capability. It will say it on the box or in the lens or in the description that it can do macro, and that just means you can get nice and close to the lens. And there's a couple of different versions of macro lenses out there. The Canon one, for example, is a 100 2.8, and there's an L version of that which is stabilized, and that's a really good all-round lens. It's 100mm, it's good for portraits, it's good for macro, and it's image stabilized, so it's good for video too. But there's all sorts of different ones out there depending on what you're actually looking to do. Then you've got things like astro lenses, so really wide angle lenses, generally speaking, but they've got kind of wide open apertures, or much wider apertures than you'd normally get. So this one actually in particular is a 15mm 2.4, so it's really good for gathering all that light at night when you're going to be trying to get as much light as you can in really, really dark scenarios. Then you've got, kind of like I mentioned earlier, you've got sports lenses, which are generally speaking going to be like sort of 400 and above, and they're generally used for either sports or wildlife photography. Trying to use those lenses for anything else is just too difficult because of how far away you would need to be from something for it to not be ridiculously huge in the frame. So those are another type of specialty lenses. And then, like I said before, you've got kind of lenses that are generally used for things like portraiture. So 85mm and 105s, they're generally used for portraiture because of the fact that it does give you this nice tight crop. So if you're looking for a particular type of lens for a particular type of photography, then there are those types of lenses out there, and it's worth looking at those if you've got that kind of niche that you want to go after. Otherwise, go with potentially one of the more versatile lenses if you're shooting a wider range of subjects. Okay, so we've touched on a huge amount there. I hope that the combination of the previous video and this video is kind of giving you everything you need to know about lenses to get going, why you might choose different focal lengths to shoot different things, and what different options are out there for you. If you do have any questions, then do hit me up in the comments and I'll try and answer them. Or like I said, go to that camera shop and talk to them about it. But next episode, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about all the different types of photography, the different genres that there are, and the different avenues you can explore as a beginner, and what you might like, because I shoot all sorts of different things. I love all sorts of different genres, but it's only when you actually explore them and you try them that you'll find out whether or not you like them. So join us for that one. Thanks for this one. I know it was a bit of a long one. Hopefully you'll check out the other videos in my complete photography series, and please do give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you've got this far, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.